The cat waits outside my door at exactly the same time every night. I moved into the house on Barrow Lane in the first week of June, which I mention because the timing matters. Not for any symbolic reason. It matters because in early June, the light in that part of Wiltshire doesn't fully leave the sky until nearly 10 o'clock. And the mornings start brightening by 2:30. And so for the first several weeks I lived there, I was almost never in darkness. I think if I'd moved in during a darker month, I would have noticed sooner. Or I wouldn't have done what I did at all. I'm not sure which is worse. The house was a mid-terrace, 3 bedrooms, on a street of almost identical houses built in the late 1960s. Pebble-dash facades, low front walls, the kind of place where every 4th house has a satellite dish and every 2nd one has a wheelie bin left out a day too long. I don't say that with any contempt. I liked it. After 6 years in a Bristol flat where I could hear my upstairs neighbor's alarm clock through the ceiling, a proper house with a front door and a back garden, and a street where people actually said good morning felt like something I'd earned. I was 31. I had a new position at the planning office in Devizes. I had, for the first time in my adult life, a sense of things being arranged in the right order. My neighbor to the left was called Paul Kinney. Retired, early 70s. A former BT engineer who'd lived on the street since the houses were built. He was one of those men who seems to have been old for 30 years without getting any older, compact and wind-browned, and always in the same canvas jacket regardless of the temperature. He kept a small, immaculate garden. He knew the name of every plant in it, not the common names, but the Latin. And he'd tell you both whether you asked or not. Paul was the one who told me about the cat. This was maybe my 2nd or 3rd evening in the house. I was out front, trying to get the recycling sorted because the previous owners had left a confusing set of bins with no labels. And Paul came over with the unhurried walk of a man who had been looking for an excuse to come over. We talked about the bins. We talked about the boiler, which he said would make a noise like a harbor seal in January, but was otherwise reliable. We talked about the woman across the street, Mrs. Adeyemi, who he said was the person to ask about anything because she'd been chair of the Residents Association for 9 years and kept a file on every planning application that had ever been submitted for the street. He said this with genuine admiration. Then he said, "You'll see a cat." I waited for more. He was looking down the street with his hands in his jacket pockets, squinting in that long June light. "Ginger thing," he said. "Not large. Comes round most evenings. Same time, give or take. Just sits by the front door." I asked if it was his. "No, nobody's, as far as anyone can tell. Been coming round for years, longer than I can properly account for, if I'm honest." He sniffed. "Just let it be. Don't feed it, don't let it in, and don't worry about it. It'll sit for a while, and then it goes." I want to be precise about the way he said this, because I've thought about it many times since, and I don't want to paint it with more significance than it had at the time. He wasn't ominous. He wasn't grave. He said it in the same tone he'd used to tell me about the boiler and the bins. The tone of a man passing along practical knowledge about a place he understood. If anything, he seemed slightly embarrassed. The way people get when they're giving advice that they know sounds odd but feel obligated to give anyway. Don't feed it. Don't let it in. As if he was worried I'd think he was being superstitious. I told him I wasn't much of a cat person anyway, and he seemed satisfied with that and went back to his garden. I saw the cat for the first time 2 nights later. I was in the front room reading with the window open because the house held heat, and I hadn't yet figured out the trick with the upstairs windows that Paul later showed me. It was just past 9, still bright, the sky that particular shade of diluted blue that June evenings have before the color drains out entirely. I heard a small, definite sound from the front step. Not a meow, more like a settling, the sound a body makes when it arranges itself on stone. I went to the window and looked down. There it was. Ginger, as Paul had said, not large. Sitting on the front step with its back to the door, facing the street, perfectly upright and perfectly still. Its fur was clean and smooth. It looked healthy, well-proportioned, the kind of cat that could belong to someone. But it had no collar, and there was something about its posture that didn't quite look like a pet. That's not the right word. It looked like a cat that had never been touched. Not feral, not wary, just self-contained in a way that made the idea of reaching down and scratching its ears feel like a category error, like trying to pet a piece of furniture. It sat there for perhaps 20 minutes. I watched it for part of that time and then went back to my book. And when I checked again, it was gone. The step was empty. I didn't see it leave. That became the pattern. Most evenings, usually between 9 and 9:15, the cat would appear on my front step, always in the same position, facing outward, sitting upright. It never meowed, never scratched at the door, never acknowledged me when I looked out the window. After a variable amount of time, always less than half an hour, it would be gone. I never once saw it arrive, and I never once saw it leave. It was simply there, and then it was simply not. I asked Paul about it again after a week or so, trying to be casual. I asked how long it had been coming. He said he wasn't sure. He said the previous owners of my house, the Hargraves, had mentioned it when they moved in, and they'd lived there for 12 years. Before the Hargraves, it had been an older couple whose name Paul couldn't remember. And he thought they'd mentioned a ginger cat too, but he wasn't certain that was the same one. Could be its offspring, he said. Could be a different cat entirely. They all look alike after a while. I asked if it visited any other houses on the street. He gave me a look I didn't know how to read. Not unfriendly, considered. Just yours, he said. Just that step. I should tell you about Mrs. Adeyemi, because she becomes important, and because she was the kind of person you need to understand in full before you can understand what she did. Gloria Adeyemi was in her mid-50s, originally from Lagos, had lived on Barrow Lane for over 20 years. She was a semi-retired solicitor. She had the Residents Association files in a set of labeled binders in her front room, which I know because she invited me over for tea during my first week and showed them to me with the contained pride of a museum curator. She knew every modification, every boundary dispute, every drainage complaint. She knew which houses had original wiring and which had been redone. She knew the history of the street the way Paul knew his garden, completely and with Latin. She also, I learned over time, knew things about the street that weren't in the binders. When I mentioned the cat to her, her reaction was different from Paul's. She didn't dismiss it or minimize it. She set down her teacup and looked at me directly and said, "Yes, the cat. What has Paul told you?" I repeated what he'd said. "Don't feed it. Don't let it in." "That's right," she said. And I would add, "Don't talk to it. I know that sounds strange, but don't address it. Don't make eye contact if you can avoid it. And don't leave your front door open after dark." I asked why. She picked up her teacup again and held it in both hands without drinking. "Because there's a pattern," she said. "And the pattern holds as long as no one disturbs it. The cat comes, the cat sits, the cat goes. That's been the way of it for longer than I've been here. And I see no reason to test what happens if someone changes the terms." There was a precision to the way she spoke that I recognized from my own work. Planning is full of people who manage uncertainty by defining boundaries. You can't control what happens inside a process, but you can control the edges, the conditions, the parameters. Gloria struck me as someone who had applied that thinking to something she couldn't explain, and had arrived at a set of operating principles that she trusted, not because she understood them, but because they had held. I respected that. I want to be clear about that. I respected it then. The thing I have to explain, the thing that makes everything that follows my responsibility, is that I was not frightened of the cat. I was not unsettled by it in any visceral way. It was odd, certainly. The regularity of it, the precision, the way it never seemed to arrive or depart, but simply transition between states of presence and absence. But I had just come from 6 years in Bristol, where my downstairs neighbor kept a python in a glass tank by the front door, and my upstairs neighbor practiced throat singing at midnight. Odd was a relative concept. The cat sat on my step and didn't bother me. I could live with that. What I couldn't live with, and this is the part that's hard to explain without sounding petty, is that I was told not to do something and given no reason beyond tradition. That has always been a problem for me, not in a reckless way. I don't consider myself someone who disregards rules. I work in planning. My entire professional life is rules. But I need to understand the mechanism. I need to know why a rule exists before I can treat it as load-bearing. And everything Paul and Gloria told me about the cat felt like a rule built on nothing but long practice. So I started to test it. In small ways at first. I'm not proud of this. I want to say that clearly. I'm not telling this story as someone who thinks they were right. The first thing I did was watch more carefully. I set a chair by the front window and noted the time the cat appeared each evening. Over 2 weeks, I logged 17 appearances. The earliest was 9:02. The latest was 9:14. The average was 9:08. The cat appeared on the step without any visible approach, sat facing outward, remained for between 11 and 27 minutes, and departed without any visible exit. I never saw it on the street before or after. I never saw it in any garden. I never saw it anywhere except that one step. That data, if I can call it that, didn't make me more cautious. It made me more curious. The regularity suggested a system. Systems have logic. Logic can be understood. The second thing I did was open the front door while the cat was there. I did this on a Tuesday evening in late June. The sky was still lit. The street was quiet, but not empty. A couple was walking a dog 3 houses down. I could hear someone's television through an open window. It was an ordinary evening. I opened the door slowly, just wide enough to see the step clearly. The cat was sitting exactly where it always sat. When the door opened, it didn't startle, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the change in any way. It continued facing the street, upright and still. I stood in the doorway and looked at it from perhaps 2 feet away. Its fur was ginger, short, clean. Its ears were intact, no signs of fighting. Its body was symmetrical in a way that I noticed specifically because most cats aren't. Most cats have a scar or a notch or an asymmetry somewhere that gives them individuality. This one looked almost templated. Not unnatural exactly, just without the particular. Like a cat drawn from description rather than observation. I stood there for perhaps a minute. The cat did not move. I closed the door. Nothing happened. No consequence, no disturbance, no change in the pattern. The cat came the next evening at 9:06 and sat and left as it always did. I felt a small, mean triumph. The feeling you get when you've proven that a rule was arbitrary. I told Paul what I'd done. Not to provoke him. I told him because I thought he'd be reassured. See, nothing happened. The cat doesn't care about the door. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was deadheading something in his garden, moving along the border with his secateurs. And he stopped and looked at me with the secateurs still open in his hand. "Right," he said, "but you didn't feed it." I said no. "And you didn't let it in?" I said no. It hadn't tried to come in. It hadn't even turned around. "Then leave it at that," he said, and went back to his deadheading. And I could see that I'd made him uncomfortable in a way that went beyond the conversation. I left it for a while after that. July came in hot and stayed hot. The planning office was busy with a contentious application for a solar farm on agricultural land south of Devizes. And I was spending my evenings reading objection letters and cross-referencing them with the environmental impact assessment. I noticed the cat when it came, noted the time out of habit, and otherwise ignored it. The data kept accumulating in a small notebook I kept by the window. The times stayed consistent. The behavior stayed identical. It was the most boring data set I had ever collected, and I found that boringness itself interesting. Because nothing alive is that consistent. Cats especially. Cats are chaos with fur. They don't do the same thing at the same time for weeks on end, without variation, unless something is structuring their behavior from outside. But I left it. I had work. I had a life assembling itself in a new place. I joined a pub quiz team that Gloria had organized. I helped Paul replace a fence panel that had blown in during a storm in late July. I was becoming, in a small and genuine way, part of Barrow Lane. And part of being part of a place is accepting its textures without needing to smooth them all flat. Then, in the second week of August, something changed. I was in the front room, as usual, and I heard the settling sound on the step at 9:07. I glanced out the window. The cat was there, in its usual position, facing the street, upright, still, clean. But this time it turned its head and looked at me. I want to describe this carefully because the strangeness of it was not in the action itself. Cats look at people. Cats look at everything. The strangeness was that in over 6 weeks of observation, this cat had never once acknowledged my existence. It had sat on my step as if I were irrelevant to whatever function the sitting served. And now it turned its head, smooth and unhurried, and looked directly through the window at me. And its eyes were a shade of green that I recognized. Not recognized in the way you recognize a color. Recognized the way you recognize a face. There was a specificity to that green that bypassed the visual part of my brain and went somewhere deeper, somewhere that had to do with memory and association and identity. I knew that green. I had seen it before, not in a cat, in a context I couldn't place. And the not placing of it felt wrong in a way that the cat's behavior had never felt wrong before. The routine was odd. This was something else. The cat held my gaze for what felt like a long time, but was probably 5 or 6 seconds. Then it turned back to face the street. A few minutes later, when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in bed in the thick August heat with the windows open and tried to place that color and couldn't. It sat in my memory like a word on the tip of my tongue, present but unresolvable. In the morning, I told myself it was nothing. That I'd been staring at a cat through a window at dusk, and my brain had done what brains do, which is find patterns where none exist. The next evening, 9:09, the cat came and sat and did not turn. The evening after, 9:04, same. The evening after that, I was at the pub quiz and didn't see whether it came at all. Things returned to normal, and I let the eye contact incident recede into the category of things that are strange, but not significant. What I did next, I did on a Saturday, August the 16th. The date is exact because I checked it afterwards in my notebook, where I'd written the time and then, below it, a single word that I'll come to. It was a warm evening, overcast. The air close and heavy the way it gets before a storm that doesn't come. I'd had a good day. I'd spent the morning at a car boot sale in Marlborough, which I mention only because it contributed to my mood, which was open and unhurried and slightly reckless the way weekends can make you when you've been working hard. I'd had 2 beers with lunch. Not enough to impair anything, just enough to soften the edges of my usual caution. At 9:06, I heard the sound on the step. I went to the window and looked down. The cat was there. It was facing the street as always. And I made a decision that I'd been circling for weeks without admitting it to myself. I went to the kitchen, opened a tin of tuna, put a small amount on a saucer, and took it to the front door. I'm going to pause here because I need you to understand my thinking, such as it was. I did not believe that feeding a stray cat would cause anything to happen. I did not believe that Gloria's rules or Paul's warnings were protecting me from a genuine threat. I believed that a harmless animal had been visiting my doorstep for years, possibly decades, and that the mythology around it was a product of the street's long memory and the human tendency to construct ritual around the unexplained. I believed that feeding it would prove this. I believed, if I'm honest, that it would be funny, that I'd tell the story at the pub quiz and Gloria would roll her eyes and Paul would shake his head, and it would become one of those neighborhood stories that people tell with affection. The new bloke fed the cat, and nothing happened, and now it follows him around the garden. I opened the front door. The cat was on the step, facing the street. I bent down and placed the saucer on the stone, just to the right of where it sat, and stepped back into the hallway. The cat turned its head, not toward the saucer, toward me. Those eyes again, that green. And this time, standing closer, in the last ambient light of an overcast August evening, I placed it. It was my mother's green, the specific, particular green of my mother's eyes, which I hadn't seen in 4 years because she died in 2020. In the first wave, in a care home in Taunton where I couldn't visit, where I couldn't be with her, where she died with strangers in PPE holding her hand instead of me. I stood in the doorway, and the cat looked at me with my dead mother's eyes, and I could not move. I need to say something about grief because it's relevant to what happened next and to what I did and didn't do. I had grieved. I had done it properly, or what I thought of as properly. I'd had counseling. I'd taken time off. I'd gone through the possessions, distributed the photographs, held the small funeral that the restrictions allowed. I had, I thought, processed it, which is a word I dislike, but which describes the mechanical reality of what you do with loss when you're a functioning adult who needs to keep paying rent. You process it. You run it through the system of your life until it comes out the other side, in a form you can store. But standing in that doorway, looking into those eyes, I understood that I had processed nothing. I had packaged it. I had wrapped it in competence and routine and put it on a high shelf where it wouldn't fall on me. And now something had climbed up and opened it, and the contents were exactly as raw as the day I'd sealed them. The cat turned away from me and looked at the saucer. It leaned down, delicately, and ate. Small, precise bites. The sound of its tongue against the ceramic was the only sound on the street. When the saucer was empty, the cat sat upright again and faced the street. I picked up the saucer and went back inside and closed the door. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From something older than fear. Something that didn't have a word. In my notebook, under the time, I wrote, "Mom." I fed the cat again the next night, and the next. Each time, The same sequence. I'd put food on the saucer, place it on the step. The cat would turn and look at me with that impossible grin. And I would stand there and feel the thing that I had told myself I'd already felt. Then it would eat, and I would go inside and sit in the dark front room and not move for a long time. I didn't tell Paul. I didn't tell Gloria. I didn't tell anyone, which should have been a sign, because the original plan had been to tell everyone, to make it a joke, to demystify the neighborhood superstition. The fact that I kept it private meant I knew, on some level I wasn't willing to access, that what was happening was not demystification. It was the opposite. On the fourth night, the cat did something new. After it finished eating, instead of facing the street again, it turned fully toward the door, toward me, and it made a sound, not a meow. I have never, in all the time I observed that animal, heard it meow. This was different. It was lower, more sustained, a sound that resonated in the chest rather than the ears. Almost a hum, almost a purr, but without the mechanical regularity of purring. It rose and fell in a way that suggested, and I know how this sounds, intentional modulation. As if it were shaping the sound towards something. And I felt, standing there in the warm August dark, that if I listened long enough, I would understand what it was shaping toward. That comprehension was close, right at the edge, like the green I'd almost placed weeks ago, like a signal resolving from static. I leaned forward. I was in the doorway. Then I was on the step. Then I was crouching beside the cat with my ear perhaps a foot from its open mouth. And the sound was filling the space between us, like water filling a vessel. Then Paul's front door opened. The sound stopped. The cat faced the street. Paul stood on his own step in his slippers and his canvas jacket, looking at me with an expression I have never seen on another human face. It was not anger. It was not surprise. It was the look of someone watching a thing that they have been afraid of for a long time finally begin to happen. "Inside," he said. Not loudly, not unkindly, the way you'd speak to someone standing on a ledge. I went inside. I closed the door. I sat on the stairs in the hallway and put my hands over my face and breathed. And the breathing sounded strange to me, the rhythm of it, as if the pattern of inhale and exhale had been subtly restructured, the gaps between breaths a little longer than they should have been, the exhalations carrying a faint tonal quality that I told myself I was imagining. Paul knocked on my door 10 minutes later. He had Gloria with him. They came in and sat in my kitchen, and Gloria made tea with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this before in this house, who knew where the mugs were before I told her. And that detail lodged in my mind like a splinter. "How many times?" Paul asked. I told him, 4 nights. He looked at Gloria. She looked at her tea. "The Hargraves fed it," Gloria said. Not immediately. They were here for almost 8 years before Martin started. He'd lost his brother. Car accident on the A36. He was, by all accounts, managing well. Going to work, seeing friends. Then he started putting food out. She took a small sip of her tea. He said it had his brother's eyes. The kitchen was very quiet. The fridge hummed. Outside, the street was empty and the sky was dark. And somewhere a car alarm was going off in brief, regular pulses. "The woman before the Hargraves," Gloria continued. "Mrs. Lowell. She fed it too, after her husband died. She said it sounded like him when it purred." She paused. She said it was trying to say something. "What happened to them?" I asked. And my voice was steady, which surprised me because nothing else about me was. Paul and Gloria looked at each other again. And in that look was a conversation I wasn't part of. The Lowells moved, Paul said carefully. Both of them. Mr. Lowell was alive when they moved in and alive when they left. He died afterwards in their new house in Chippenham of nothing unusual. But Mrs. Lowell spent 3 years here feeding that cat, and by the end of it, she said it was speaking to her in full sentences, and she was answering, and she couldn't always remember afterwards what she'd said. The Hargraves, Gloria said, separated. Martin moved to his mother's in Warminster. Jenny stayed another year, tried to sell, couldn't at first. The cat came every night to an empty step, and she said it sat differently when there was no one feeding it. She said it waited differently. She said the waiting had a quality. A quality, I repeated. Her word. She came to me near the end and asked me to look at the original land records for the plot. I did. This house, your house, is built on the footprint of an older structure. 18th century. There are parish records. Not much, but enough to confirm the site has been continuously occupied since at least 1740. And the cat, I said. Gloria set down her tea. There's a reference in the parish burial register for 1758. A note in the margin, not part of the official entry. Someone wrote in quite clear hand, "The ginger waits at barrow." No other context, no associated burial. Just that. 1758. 267 years before I moved in. If you accepted that it was the same animal, which I did not, which I could not, except that I was sitting in my kitchen with 2 people who had watched this street for decades, and who were looking at me with the patient, weary care of people who had stopped needing to believe and started simply managing. What does it want? I asked. We don't know, Paul said. And the honesty of it, the complete lack of a theory or a framework, was more frightening than any explanation would have been. We've never known. We just know what it does. It comes, it sits. If you leave it alone, it goes. If you feed it, it sees you. If it sees you, it shows you something you've lost. If you keep feeding it, it starts to speak. If you listen long enough. He stopped. He was looking at his hands, which were resting on my kitchen table, brown and scarred and very still. If you listen long enough, I said. Mrs. Lowell told me once, about a month before they moved, that she had started hearing her husband's voice not just from the cat, but from inside her own head. Not like a memory, like a broadcast. She said it was coming through her own thoughts, the way a radio station bleeds into an adjacent frequency. She said she would be thinking her own thoughts, and then, without any boundary or transition, she would be thinking his thoughts, and she couldn't always tell which were which. I sat with that for a long time. The car alarm outside had stopped. The fridge hummed. Gloria finished her tea and rinsed the mug and put it on the draining board with the handle facing left, which is not how I leave my mugs, which is how someone who used to live in this kitchen left them. What do I do? I asked. You stop, Gloria said. Tonight. You don't feed it again. You don't open the door when it's there. You go back to what Paul told you on the first day, and you stay there. And the eyes? I said. The sound. They'll fade, Paul said. But he said it the way you say things you need to be true, rather than things you know to be true. And Gloria didn't contradict him, but she didn't confirm him either. They left. I locked the front door and the back door, and went upstairs and lay on my bed in the dark and did not sleep. The heat was immense. The house was silent. I was listening, I realized, listening for the sound the cat had made, the rising and falling hum that had almost resolved into meaning. And the listening itself frightened me because it was not voluntary. I was not choosing to listen. My attention had been redirected, like a river that someone has dammed and channeled. And it was flowing toward a point of reception that I had not built and did not control. At 9:08, I heard the settling sound on the front step. I did not go downstairs. I lay on my bed and looked at the ceiling. And the ceiling was just a ceiling. And the house was just a house. And the sound on the step was just an animal sitting down on stone. I told myself these things in the careful, deliberate way you construct a wall. One statement at a time, each one placed and mortared before the next. At 9:12, I heard the hum. It came up through the floor, through the structure of the house, through the joists and plaster and carpet, attenuated but present. And it was not the same as hearing it from 2 feet away on the doorstep. It was wider. It filled the room the way a smell fills a room, without direction, without a single point of origin, just there, part of the air. And in the hum, for the first time, I heard a word. I'm not going to tell you what it was, not because it was frightening or obscene or revealing, because it was ordinary. It was a word my mother used to say, a word that was part of the private language of our family. And hearing it in that sound, in that room in the dark, was the most violent thing that has ever happened to me. I don't mean violent in the sense of force or harm. I mean violent in the sense of sudden total exposure, of a boundary removed without warning, of something inside you being made outside. The word was just a word, but it proved that whatever was on my doorstep had access to the things that no animal, no external entity of any kind, should have access to. It was inside my loss. It was wearing my grief like a garment and speaking from inside it. I put my pillow over my head. I pressed it down until my ears ached. The word continued, not louder, not softer, not through my ears at all, I realized. It was in the same place. Mrs. Lowell had described. It was in the frequency adjacent to my own thoughts, bleeding in, and the pillow was as useless against it as a curtain against radiation. I don't know how long it lasted. I know that at some point I began to hum back. I know this because I caught myself doing it, which means there was a period before the catching where I was doing it without awareness, matching the tone, finding the resonance. And when I caught myself, I stopped, and the stopping felt like tearing adhesive off skin, painful and wrong, as if I were breaking a connection that my body had made without consulting me. I got up and went to the bathroom and turned on the tap and put my head under the cold water and held it there until the shock of the temperature replaced every other sensation. When I straightened up and looked in the mirror, my eyes were bloodshot and my face was pale, and I looked like someone who had been crying for hours, which I hadn't or didn't think I had. I went to the window at the front of the landing and looked down at the step. The cat was gone. In its place on the stone was a pattern, wet, as if something had been licked onto the surface, a darker patch on the pale stone, and in the streetlight I could almost make out a shape. Not a letter, not a symbol, a shape that my eyes kept trying to organize into meaning, the way they might try to find a face in a cloud, except this was the reverse. This was a meaning trying to organize itself into a shape, and it hadn't quite managed. And the failure of it, the almost there-ness, was worse than if it had been legible, because legibility would have been finite. This was open. This was still becoming. I closed the curtain and went back to bed and lay there until the light came back, which in August is early. And the birds started, which in that part of Wiltshire is a slow, layered accumulation of sound that begins with a single robin and builds over 20 minutes into a full dawn chorus. And that morning, it was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard, because it was the sound of something that did not want anything from me. I didn't feed the cat again. I want that to be the shape of this story, the neat arc. He was told not to. He did anyway. He learned why. He stopped. But the truth is more complicated and less satisfying. And I'm telling it because the true version is the one that matters. I stopped feeding the cat. The cat did not stop coming. Every evening, 9:07, 9:10, 9:03, it appeared on the step and sat and faced the street, and I did not open the door, and I did not put food on a saucer. And I stayed away from the front window, and I waited for it to leave. And it did leave, every night, after its usual interval. But the interval was getting longer. In the first week after I stopped, it stayed for 31 minutes, then 38, then 45. By the end of August, it was sitting on my step for over an hour. And I could hear the hum through the door, through the walls, through the floor, faint but constant. And in the hum, there were more words now. Not sentences, just words, isolated and clear, and each one a fishhook in the lining of my chest. I went to Gloria. I sat in her front room with the binders on the shelves behind me, and I told her everything, the eyes, the sound, the word, the humming back. She listened without interrupting, without expression, her hands folded on her lap. When I finished, she said, "The Lowells didn't just move because of what Mrs. Lowell heard. They moved because Mr. Lowell started hearing it too." I stared at her. He hadn't fed it. He hadn't opened the door. He hadn't done anything. But whatever his wife had opened, it expanded. It moved from her to him. Not quickly, over months. He started hearing a voice he couldn't identify, someone he hadn't lost, someone he didn't recognize. He said it was like remembering a grief that wasn't his. They left because they were frightened it would spread further, to the neighbors, to the street. Did it? I don't know, she said. They left, and the cat went back to sitting and waiting, and the next people moved in, and the pattern started over. She looked at me, and her eyes were clear and tired and completely serious. It's patient. Whatever it is, however it works, it's patient. It can wait. It's been waiting since at least 1758. It will wait for you to open the door again, and if you don't, it will wait for the next person. The only thing you can do is not be the one who opens it wider. But I've already opened it, I said. Yes, she said. You have. We sat in her front room, and the afternoon light came through the window and fell across the binders on the shelves, and the room was warm and ordinary and full of documented, comprehensible history. And outside, the street was a street where people lived and mowed their lawns and argued about parking and put their bins out. And somewhere in the foundation of my house, in the stone and soil beneath it, something was sitting at a frequency I had tuned myself to receive, and I could not untune. September came. The light shortened. The evenings closed in, and the cat arrived earlier, creeping forward in sync with the sunset, always appearing in the last 15 minutes of usable daylight, as if it were tied to the transition, to the threshold between one state and another. I started spending my evenings at the pub, at Gloria's, at Paul's, anywhere but home. It helped. Distance attenuated the signal, if I can call it that. When I was at Paul's house, 30 feet from my own front door, I could feel a faint pull, a gravitational lean in the direction of home. But it was manageable. When I was at the pub in the village, half a mile away, I couldn't feel it at all. But I always had to go home. And every night, walking up Barrow Lane, I would see my house and know that the cat was or had been on the step. And as I got closer, the pull would strengthen, and by the time I put my key in the lock, I would be holding my breath the way you do when you're trying not to inhale something, as if the influence were airborne, as if I could keep it out of my lungs. Some nights I managed. I went inside, went straight upstairs, put on headphones, played music loud enough to fill every available channel of my attention, and lay there until sleep took me. Other nights, the headphones weren't enough, and the music was just a surface that the hum penetrated from beneath. And on those nights, I would lie in the dark and hear the words, and each word was a room in a house I had thought I'd left, and the doors were all open and the lights were on, and someone was inside, waiting. And the waiting had a quality. I began to understand why the Hargraves had separated, why the Lowells had moved. It wasn't the cat. It wasn't the sound. It was the intimacy of it. Something had access to the most private part of my interior life. The loss I had packaged and shelved, the grief I had processed into something I could carry. And it was unwrapping it, nightly, patiently, and laying it out in the space between my thoughts. And the exposure was unbearable, not because it hurt, but because it was tender. That's the thing I couldn't explain to Paul or Gloria, the thing that made it so difficult to resist. It was not menacing. It was not hostile. It was tender. It handled my grief with a care that felt like love. And the love felt real, and I wanted it to be real. And the wanting was the danger. The wanting was the door. In October, something happened that I still don't fully understand. I came home late from a council meeting, and after 10, well after the cat's usual window. The street was dark and quiet. I walked up to my front door, and the step was empty. I unlocked the door and went inside and turned on the hall light and stopped. There was a saucer on the floor by the front door. A small ceramic saucer with a thin film of tuna residue on it. I had not put it there. I had not bought tuna in weeks. I had thrown away the saucer I'd used, actually put it in the bin rather than washing it, because I hadn't wanted it in my kitchen, hadn't wanted the physical object associated with the feeding to remain in my house. I picked up the saucer. It was cold, clean except for the residue. And it was not mine. It was white with a thin blue line around the rim. I had never owned a saucer like it. I went to Paul's house. He answered the door in his pajamas, looked at the saucer, looked at me, and didn't say anything for a long time. "That's one of the Hargraves," he said finally. "Jenny had a set like that, white with the blue line. She took them when she left." He paused. "She definitely took them when she left." We stood on his doorstep, and the street was quiet, and the air was cold, properly cold for the first time that autumn. And I was holding a saucer that belonged to a woman who had moved away years ago, and it had been inside my locked house, with food on it. And neither of us had an explanation, and neither of us tried to construct one. "You could move," Paul said. He said it gently, without pressure. The way you offer a tissue to someone who might or might not be about to cry. An option, held out at arm's length. Would that work? It worked for the Lowells. Mostly, Mr. Lowell said the voice faded after they left. Never entirely, but it faded. He looked down the street toward my house. Mrs. Lowell said it didn't fade for her. She said she could still hear it in Chippenham, fainter but clear. She said it was like having a radio in a room you can't find. She said she got used to it. Got used to it. Her words. I didn't move. I want to tell you the reason was practical. That I had a mortgage and a job and a life on Barrow Lane that I wasn't willing to abandon. And those things were true. But they weren't the reason. The reason, and I'm ashamed of this, is that part of me didn't want the sound to stop. Part of me, the part that had crouched on the doorstep and leaned toward the hum and hummed back without knowing. Wanted to hear what came next. Wanted the words to become sentences. Wanted the sentences to become my mother's voice, fully formed, speaking to me in the dark from somewhere I couldn't see but could feel. And the wanting of that was so strong and so specific that it overrode every rational warning, every documented history, every piece of evidence that what was happening to me had happened before, and it ended in displacement and separation, and a voice that never fully went away. Gloria came to see me in November. She brought a cardboard box. In it were photocopies of the parish records she'd mentioned, and a folder of handwritten notes that Mrs. Lowell had left with her, and a letter from Jenny Hargrave that Gloria had received 2 years after the Hargraves moved out. "I want you to read these," she said, "not because they'll explain anything, because they'll show you the progression." I read them over the course of a week. Mrs. Lowell's notes were meticulous, daily entries in small, careful handwriting, documenting the cat's visits, the duration, the sounds, the words she heard. Reading them was like reading my own notebook in someone else's hand. The same data, the same observations, the same careful attempt to impose order on something that resisted it. She had noted the eye color. She had noted the hum. She had noted the moment when the words began. And in the margin next to that entry she had written, in slightly larger letters, as if pressing harder on the pen, "It knows Arthur's name for the garden gate." Jenny Hargrave's letter was different. It wasn't a report. It was a plea. She asked Gloria to watch the house, to warn whoever moved in next, to make sure they understood the rules. She wrote that Martin had never fully recovered, that he still woke some nights speaking in his brother's cadence, using phrases his brother had used, and that he sometimes couldn't tell whether the thoughts in his head were his own or inherited, and that the not telling had made him someone she could no longer reach. The last line of the letter was, "It doesn't take anything from you. It gives you something you can't give back." I put the papers back in the box and returned them to Gloria, and we sat in her front room and drank tea, and I said, "Why doesn't everyone on the street know about this? Why isn't it public?" She looked at me with an expression that was almost amused, if amusement could be that sad. "What would I tell them? There's a cat that reads your grief and speaks to you in the voices of your dead?" Who would I tell? The council? The RSPCA? I manage it. That's what I do. I manage it the way you'd manage a watercourse or a subsidence. You don't fix it. You don't explain it. You document it, and you set rules, and you pass them along, and you hope. And when someone breaks the rules, then you help them understand what they've done, and you help them live with it. I live with it. It's May now. The cat still comes. 9:07, 9:11, 9:03. It sits on the step and faces the street, and I don't open the door, and I don't put food out, and I don't go to the window. The hum comes through the walls every evening, and I put on headphones and play music, and the music is enough, mostly, to fill the space where the words would otherwise form. Mostly. There are nights, usually the still ones, the nights when the air is heavy and the street is quiet and the music can't quite reach the bottom of my attention, when a word surfaces, just one, a word my mother would have used, a word that no one else would know to use, in the tone she would have used it, with the warmth she would have put in it. And on those nights, I lie in the dark and I miss her with a completeness that feels too large to have come from inside me, as if the grief has been augmented, expanded, fed by something external until it fills every room in my head, and there is no space left for the thought that would save me, the thought that says, this is not her, this has never been her. Whatever is on your doorstep is using the shape of your loss, the way water uses the shape of a container. And it will fill you if you let it. And the filling will feel like love, because love and its imitation are made of the same materials, and the difference between them is something you can only detect from the outside. Paul checks on me. Gloria checks on me. They knock on my door and bring tea and sit with me, and their presence helps, not because they say the right things, but because they are real and proximate, and their voices come from outside my head, and I can tell the difference. That's the thing I hold on to. I can still tell the difference. The cat has not changed. It has not aged, not that I can see. Its fur is still clean, still smooth. Its posture is still perfect. It sits on my step as it has sat on the steps of this house, since a hand wrote, "The ginger waits at Barrow," in the margin of a burial register before the American Revolution. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it wants, if wanting is even a category that applies. I know what it does. It waits. It watches. It finds the specific frequency of your loss, and it tunes itself to it, and it offers you a signal that is indistinguishable from the thing you most want to hear. And the only defense is to not listen. And not listening to the voice of someone you love is its own kind of violence, its own kind of loss. And you have to choose it every night. You have to choose it again and again. And the choosing doesn't get easier because the thing you're choosing against is patient and tender and knows your mother's name for the garden gate. I have not opened the door since August. I open it in my dreams sometimes. In the dreams, the cat comes inside and sits on the kitchen chair where my mother used to sit when she visited, and it speaks to me in her voice, and we talk for hours about nothing important, about the garden, about the weather, about the neighbor's dog. And when I wake up, the loss of that conversation is worse than the original loss, worse than the death, because the death was final, and this is not final, this is ongoing. This is a door that I keep closed every night, knowing that on the other side of it, something is waiting with perfect patience and perfect knowledge. And what might be, what might almost be, love. Gloria asked me once if I was going to move. I said no. She asked me why. I said because if I leave, someone else will move in, and the cat will wait for them. And they won't have Paul next door to tell them the rules, or Gloria across the street to keep the records, or a box of notes from the people who came before. They'll be alone with it. And maybe they'll have lost someone too, because most people have. And the cat will find that frequency and tune itself to it and offer them the signal, and there will be no one to pull them back from the doorstep. She looked at me for a long time after I said that. That's a good reason, she said. It's also the reason Mrs. Lowell gave. I know, the cat comes tonight. It will come tomorrow. It will come for as long as this house stands, and probably for whatever stands after it. I don't open the door. I don't feed it. I don't listen when I can help it. And when I can't help it, when the word comes through the walls and through the headphones and through the music and lands in the exact center of the place where my mother used to be, I hold still and I breathe and I wait for it to pass. And it passes. And the passing is not relief, but it's near neighbor. The quiet on the other side of a sound you didn't quite hear, which is almost silence, which is almost peace, which is almost enough.